The sound that woke me up that Tuesday morning wasn't an alarm clock, it was fiberglass cracking. If you've ever owned a boat, especially one you've spent years restoring with your own hands, you'll know exactly why that sound still shows up in my nightmares. What I didn't know at the time was that the man responsible for it was about to destroy his own life over a fight worth less than a nice dinner in Charleston. My name is Ryan Mercer. I'm 44 years old, and for most of my life I've worked around boats. Not the glamorous side people see in magazines, but the greasy side. Engines that won't start, fuel systems clogged with salt, electrical problems that somehow only happen on holiday weekends. I spent 22 years building a reputation along the South Carolina coast as the guy people called when nobody else could fix the problem. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and eventually it paid for something bigger. Back in 2015, after years of saving, borrowing, negotiating, and more stress than I care to remember, I bought Harbor Point Marina just outside a small coastal town called Seabrook Landing. It sat on a little over 6 acres of waterfront property with 24 slips, a maintenance shed, parking areas, fuel access, and one thing that would later become very important, a private access road that crossed my land before reaching a gated waterfront neighborhood next door. That neighborhood had existed for decades before I bought the marina. The residents used the road every day. Delivery trucks used it. Landscapers used it. Kids rode bikes across it. Nobody ever paid me for access, and honestly, I never cared. My father raised me with a simple rule. If helping people costs you nothing, help them. For years, that's exactly what I did. Then Victor Holloway moved in. Now, every neighborhood seems to have one Victor. You know the type. Retired executive. Expensive watch. Perfect smile. Loves introducing himself by mentioning companies he used to run. Within 2 months of moving into the neighborhood, he was elected president of the Homeowners Association. At first, I thought he seemed harmless. Then the letters started showing up. The first one arrived on a Thursday afternoon. According to Victor, the marina owed the HOA $600 a month toward maintaining what he called our shared access infrastructure. I actually laughed when I read it. Shared? There wasn't anything shared about it. The road sat entirely on my property. The county records proved it. The survey proved it. The deed proved it. My attorney proved it in about 3 minutes after looking at the paperwork. Ryan, he said while sliding the documents back across his desk, this might be the easiest bill I've ever told someone not to pay. So I didn't. Instead, I politely responded. Then Victor sent another letter. Then another. Then another. Over the next few months, I sent certified responses explaining the same thing over and over. The road belonged to the marina. The marina belonged to me. There was no agreement requiring payment. Every response seemed to make him angrier. One afternoon, he actually showed up at my office. I remember because I was rebuilding an engine injector system when he walked in wearing loafers that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. He looked around the shop like he was inspecting a crime scene. You know, he said, people around here are getting tired of being taken advantage of. I wiped my hands with a rag and looked at him. Taken advantage of? The community uses that road. I know. You should contribute. I already do. His smile disappeared. What does that mean? It means I let everybody use it for free. For a second, he just stared at me. Then he leaned forward. You may own a marina, Mr. Mercer, but communities work through cooperation. I nodded. Funny thing is, Victor, cooperation usually starts with asking instead of demanding. He left without another word. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became personal. Over the following weeks, complaints started appearing out of nowhere. Anonymous reports, questions about permits, calls about marina safety, inspections that somehow always seemed connected to the HOA. Nothing serious enough to hurt the business, but enough to make one thing clear. Victor wanted me to know he could make life difficult. The problem was that people like Victor often mistake patience for weakness. Then came the boat. My yacht wasn't just expensive. It was personal. I'd spent years restoring her. Long nights after work. Weekends when everyone else was relaxing. Thousands of hours fixing, upgrading, rebuilding. When I looked at that vessel, I didn't see money. I saw 20 years of sacrifice. Victor saw leverage. A week before everything exploded, I received notice that the HOA board had voted to classify the yacht as an aesthetic nuisance and a liability to neighboring property values. The funny part? The yacht wasn't even on HOA property. It was sitting in my marina, on my dock, in my water. At that point, I honestly thought the whole thing was ridiculous enough to blow over. I was wrong, because 5 days later, just after sunrise, my security cameras captured something that changed everything, and standing beside a crane, pointing directly at my yacht, was Victor Holloway. Standing beside that crane, Victor looked less like a homeowners association president and more like a man who had convinced himself he was untouchable. I remember staring at the monitor in my kitchen, coffee still in my hand, trying to understand what I was seeing. At first, I honestly thought maybe there was some kind of emergency. Maybe the dock had been damaged. Maybe a storm warning had come through overnight. Then I watched one of the operators point toward my yacht, and Victor nodded. That's when I dropped the coffee mug. By the time I got to the marina, the damage was already happening. The crane crew had lifted the yacht incorrectly, putting pressure where no pressure should ever be applied. I could hear the hull groaning. One loud crack echoed across the water. Then another. I ran toward the dock yelling for them to stop. The workers froze. Victor didn't. He stood there with his hands folded across his chest like he was supervising a landscaping project. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. He looked at me calmly. "Removing a liability." I actually laughed because the answer was so insane that my brain couldn't process it. "That's my yacht. Not according to the compliance order." "What compliance order?" "The board voted." I looked around at the workers. Every one of them suddenly found something interesting to stare at besides me. Then I looked back at Victor. "You voted on property you don't own. That's a legal matter." "No," I said, pointing at the cracked hull. "That is a legal matter." For the first time, his confidence slipped just a little. Not much, just enough. The crane operator climbed down and quietly asked whether he should continue. Victor answered before I could speak. "Finish the job." Another terrible grinding sound came from the yacht. The steering assembly snapped. Part of the rear deck split. I stood there watching years of work being destroyed by a man whose biggest qualification seemed to be believing his own authority. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. What saved me was that I didn't lose my temper. Trust me, I wanted to. Every instinct in my body wanted to drag Victor off that dock and scream in his face. Instead, I handed the responding officer a tablet containing security footage from 6 different camera angles. The officer watched for less than 3 minutes before asking Victor a question that changed the entire situation. "Sir, do you have documentation authorizing this removal?" Victor started talking immediately. People like him always do. Long explanations. Big words. References to committees and regulations and liability concerns. The officer listened quietly. Then he asked again, "Do you have documentation authorizing removal of private property from private property?" Victor didn't answer right away. That was the moment I knew he understood he had made a mistake. Over the next 48 hours, things moved fast. Faster than even my attorney expected. Marine surveyors inspected the yacht. Insurance investigators arrived. Structural specialists reviewed the damage. Final estimate? $187,000. When that number landed on the district attorney's desk, the conversation stopped being civil and became criminal. Suddenly, Victor wasn't dealing with me anymore. He was dealing with prosecutors. Felony property destruction, criminal vandalism, conspiracy concerns involving board authorization. The local newspaper got hold of the story before the HOA could spin it. By Friday morning, everyone in town was talking about it. The headline practically wrote itself. Waterfront HOA president under investigation after marina dispute escalates. Then something interesting happened. My phone started ringing. Not from reporters, not from lawyers, from residents inside Victor's community. Some were angry, some were embarrassed. A few were genuinely apologetic. One older woman named Martha called and said, "Ryan, I've lived here 17 years. I had no idea he was doing any of this." I believed her. Most of them had no idea. That's when I realized something important. The residents weren't my problem. Victor was. Unfortunately for them, they were about to suffer the consequences of his decisions anyway. That weekend I sat in my office with my attorney, Ethan. We spread property surveys across the table. Easement maps, county records, title documents, access agreements, everything. Ethan kept reading. Then he looked up and smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was the kind lawyers get when they discover something expensive. "Ryan," he said, tapping one section of the survey. "Have you ever noticed this?" "Noticed what?" "There is no permanent access easement." I stared at him. "You're kidding." "Nope." We checked again. Then again. then a fourth time because it sounded impossible. The neighborhood's primary entrance crossed marina property entirely through informal historical use. Decades of convenience. No legal guarantee. No ownership rights. No recorded easement. Nothing. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Legally speaking, you've been doing them a favor for years. I sat there quietly for a moment. Outside the office window, I could see workers repairing fuel lines along the docks. Boats rocked gently in the afternoon tide. Everything looked normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Victor had crossed a line. Not a property line. A human line. There are disagreements you can work through. There are misunderstandings you can fix. Then there are moments when someone intentionally destroys something you've spent years building simply because they believe they can. That's where we were. Monday morning I hired contractors. By Monday afternoon installation crews were on site. Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after my yacht had been damaged, electronic gates appeared at every road entrance crossing marina property. RFID access systems. Automated barriers. Heavy steel posts. High-definition security cameras. Large signs. Private property. Authorized access only. No public right-of-way. By noon the road was closed. The reaction was immediate. Absolute chaos. The neighborhood had become dependent on that shortcut for decades. Without it, residents faced a detour adding several miles to every trip. School routes changed. Commutes doubled. Delivery schedules fell apart. Landscapers complained. Contractors complained. Everybody complained. By evening I had more than 20 voicemails. By the next morning I had nearly 60. Most weren't angry at me. They were angry at Victor. The community Facebook page exploded. Residents started asking questions. Why had the HOA targeted the marina owner? Why was the board interfering with private property? Why hadn't members been informed? Why was their president facing criminal charges? Every answer led back to the same person. Victor Holloway. 3 days later I drove past the neighborhood entrance and saw something I never expected. A group of residents standing outside arguing with board members. One man was waving a newspaper. Another was holding copies of public records. Somebody shouted, "You told us none of this was real." Somebody else yelled, "He destroyed the man's boat." It was the first time I realized the entire narrative was collapsing around Victor. He had spent months portraying himself as the protector of the community. Now the community was beginning to understand that he had created the crisis himself. And as the pressure kept building, the district attorney officially announced charges were being reviewed. The moment that news hit local television, panic spread through the HOA leadership like a wildfire. Because suddenly this wasn't about a $600 fee anymore. It wasn't about a road. It wasn't about neighborhood politics. It was about a man who had mistaken authority for ownership and an entire community discovering the true cost of following him. By the following week, the pressure had become impossible for Victor to contain. Every day seemed to bring a new problem. More residents demanding answers. More reporters asking questions. More attorneys getting involved. The man who had walked around acting like the king of the neighborhood suddenly couldn't walk into a board meeting without being confronted by people he claimed to represent. The breaking point came during a city council session that had originally been scheduled to discuss traffic concerns caused by the road closure. What nobody expected was how quickly the conversation would turn. I showed up carrying a box filled with documents. Property surveys. Deeds. Certified letters. Maintenance records. Security footage. Everything. Ethan sat beside me. Across the room sat Victor and 2 attorneys who looked like they hadn't slept in days. The room was packed. Residents filled nearly every seat. Reporters lined the back wall. When my turn came, I simply laid out the facts. I explained the ownership history of the marina. I explained the access road. I explained the months of demands, the letters, the threats, and finally the destruction of the yacht. Then the security footage played. The room became so quiet you could hear the projector fan spinning. Nobody said a word while Victor appeared on screen directing the operation that damaged the yacht. When the video ended, the silence somehow felt even louder. Then something happened that I don't think anyone planned. One board member stood up and resigned. A second followed. Then a third. Right there in front of everyone. You could almost feel the room shifting. The narrative was over. The excuses were over. The finger-pointing was over. People were finally seeing the situation for what it had always been. Not a community dispute. Not a disagreement between neighbors. Just one arrogant man making a series of terrible decisions. Within days, Residents organized a petition demanding Victor's removal from office. Signatures poured in. Calls flooded the HOA office. The same people who had once applauded him now wanted him gone. Then came the phone call. 6 days after the council meeting, Ethan called me while I was working on an engine rebuild. Victor's attorneys want to talk. I set down my wrench. About what? Ethan laughed. Everything. We met 2 days later. Victor looked different. Not dramatically different. Just smaller somehow. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. For the first time since I met him, he looked like a man facing consequences instead of creating them. His attorney got straight to the point. The criminal case was serious. The evidence was overwhelming. A conviction could change the rest of his life. They wanted a resolution. I listened quietly. Then I slid a contract across the table. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The agreement was simple. If the neighborhood wanted guaranteed access through marina property, there would now be a formal lease. Monthly access fees. Parking agreements. Maintenance responsibilities. Strict payment deadlines. Automatic penalties for violations. And on top of that, full financial restitution for the yacht damage. Victor stared at the numbers for a long time. "You're serious?" he finally asked. I looked at him. "Were you serious when you destroyed my boat?" The room went silent again. He looked away first. 3 days later, the agreement was signed. Shortly after that, he officially resigned as HOA president. The criminal matter moved toward a negotiated resolution. Restitution was secured, and the neighborhood regained access under terms everyone finally understood and respected. Funny thing is, once everything became formal, most residents and I actually got along better than we ever had before. Without Victor creating drama, people were surprisingly reasonable. Some even stopped by the marina just to apologize for how everything unfolded. One family brought homemade cookies. Another dropped off a handwritten card. Martha, the woman who had called me earlier, started bringing coffee whenever she walked near the docks. Life slowly returned to normal. Well, mostly normal. These days Harbor Point Marina is worth several times what I originally paid for it. The business is thriving. The road agreement continues to generate steady revenue. The yacht has been repaired, and every now and then, usually on quiet mornings when the water is calm and the docks are still empty, I think about how differently this story could have ended. If Victor had simply asked instead of demanded. If he had treated people with respect instead of assuming power gave him ownership. If he had understood that being successful in one part of life doesn't automatically make you right in every other part. The strangest part of all, I still see him occasionally. He drives through the access road just like everyone else. Sometimes he gives a small wave. Sometimes I wave back. Not because we're friends. Not because everything is forgotten. But because eventually there comes a point when winning isn't about revenge anymore. It's about knowing the truth survived. Still, I'm curious what you think. If someone destroyed property you spent years building because they believed they had the authority to do it, would you have reopened the road at all? Or would you have left the gates closed and let the entire neighborhood deal with the consequences? Let me know down in the comments because this debate has been going on for years, and honestly, I still hear arguments on both sides.